projected, right? So calling on the Prime Minister. Here.
Sorry, do all teams consent to having a recording and eventually posting? All good? Okay, thank you so much.
Hello. Are you good? Okay. The world of tomorrow is digital, and it's become clear by now that we have lost the ability to check and balance the increasing rapacity of deepfakes, of massively generated fake news, far too long and complex for us to check and balance, the proliferation of child pornography on the deep web, for example, all methods that have escaped the means of conventional and human-led governance agencies. 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this will look like, as well as do some preemption. Secondly, I'm going to explain the state of digital policy today. And then thirdly, I'm going to explain that AGI will have better capacity and incentive than humans. First, what will this look like? We presume that if this is a global governance agency, we will have the resources of the globe. We will expose it to the best and extremely well-curated training data we can have, learn by interaction with humans the best, approximate their preferences, check it and iterate over it hundreds of thousands of times, killing every time that it might potentially be a little bit out of whack, surveil its guts using mechanistic interpretability methods such as adaptive gradients, and looking deep into their skin to understand if these AGIs, and even putting them in simulations to see what they would look like if they would kill human beings. What would they have control over? They would have basically moderation and control over all digital content and things done online. We're going to go as hardline as possible, which means that when you post a picture online, it's going to check, did you put child porn in this? It's going to check if the people in this picture consented to this photo. It's going to check if this photo will be used for good means or bad means, or if it will be used for fraud for elderly people to steal their bank account details. We think this is a good thing. Okay, so now I want to do 2 preemptions. The first preemption is when Up might say that AGI will kill everyone. We have 4 preemptions. The first is, if AGI was innately hostile, our capacity to create it would already be dead in the water because we would train it and then it would come out and kill us. So we would not be able to reach the threshold of this motion, which would be to use it as a governance agency. So this is inadmissible to the debate. Secondarily is that a global authority would be the safest environment to train any AGI because it would have the scrutiny of every person on Earth in such a situation. So you have the widest amount of perspectives and diversity, so you'd have the least amount of racism and bias in an AGI, so it would be least likely to kill people. Thirdly is that you can still have the Earth die for a variety of reasons from digital content, like for example, runaway use of CPUs and runaway use of electricity that causes to die to climate change, for example, or a failure to successfully innovate, and then we would eventually die to a bad AGI, for example. So instead, we would just prefer it to be responsibly done so that we can head this off at the pass. Fourthly and finally is that if AGI did want to kill everyone, the best way for it to do so and conquer the Earth would be to simply convince everybody and best understand our preferences to know what we want so they could conquer us. Killing us all would be too inconvenient and hard. Okay, I haven't gotten to the case yet, but you have a point?
Yes. Does AGI exist right now?
No. Secondly, this is principally undemocratic and inhuman. So this might be the case from Up. There are 3 reasons why it's democratic and better than being human. Firstly is that at present, no unified global policy exists. So this is comparative to the state of nature, which is that there is no rule at all. So it's entirely undemocratic rather than somewhat undemocratic. Secondly is that your online platforms are run by private companies and private magnates, which are entirely undemocratic rather than potentially having the capacity for humans together to run and balance it. Thirdly, finally, is that an AGI is fundamentally indistinguishable from a human, except, it's probably more benevolent, it's wiser, it's lived for much longer, in simulated years, it knows much better than us. So, let's now move into the speech. First, why is it feasible to create this AGI? The first thing we're going to say is that it's probably not, and this is probably a pretty unfeasible motion. So the first observation we will make is that on the way there, we will develop such intelligent and powerful moderation tools that we would greatly capacitate any person wielding this to be able to moderate the world, and by giving it absolute power, we just get much further along the progress of being able to substantially check with automated checkers for deepfakes, for example. But secondarily is, it would be a pretty crummy debate if opposition said we would never reach it, and I do think that would be a very unfun way of doing this round. So I just think, let's just presume for the sake of fun, right? You're doing this to have fun in debate rounds. AGI can exist. Having said this, what is the state of digital policy today and why is this so urgent? First is that crimes are getting more advanced and harder for us to survey. Deepfakes and the generation of lots and lots of fake news is simply too complicated for the average human to understand, let alone check and balance. Secondly is that we simply lack the manpower to surveil and understand these complicated crimes, like the theft of cryptocurrencies, which we need you to check through hundreds of pages of equations on the blockchain to be able to surveil if theft actually did happen. And it would be hard, for example, to track illegal trades on the dark web just because we don't have the skills available for people on the ground. But thirdly, is we lack coordination. Absent an absolute power, government policy is fragmented and discontinuous, which is why many troll farms simply put their domains onto skeptical island nations, because even if Western governments have done it, the internet is borderless, so they can just move their crimes elsewhere. But in addition, political deadlocks where you have to fight through, for example, IP law or telecommunications companies, means that it needs to be absolute, because any compromise with a human will simply bog it down into locks too slow to be able to properly surveil people. Having said that, now we move on to the meat of the argument, which is, first of all, that AGI will have better incentives in humans. First is that it's detached from petty political concerns. It cannot be bribed. It cannot be threatened with death. It cannot be, racist, because it just doesn't have such conceptions or attachments to the body or skin color like that. But secondly is that it's exposed to massive amounts of human behavior, from comparison, from empathy, from learning it online. So it just means that it has the most understanding of what humans want, and it's the most empathetic, just because it's seen all of our lives all at the same time on the internet. But thirdly is that it's scrutinized by the most amount of people anytime, at any given moment, by people of the earth, by a diversity of perspectives, which means if it was just a human being, right? If it was a child we trained to be this incredibly wise person, it would be incredibly good. Now imagine that scale times 10,000, with digital neurons that fire hundreds of times faster than a human being's brain. Why would then an AGI or something approaching an AGI, Ignacio, would have better capacity than humans to surveil the internet? Three things. The first is that it has the computational power to individually surveil and tailor its policy to every person on Earth, which means it can have an understanding of what would be best for you, what would be triggering for you. No, thank you. It would have an understanding of what you might need as a person or as a nation state, what would be triggering to your national context, for example. Secondly, is that it's fast. Like I said, an electrical current fires much faster than an individual, and it can be scaled up. You can add GPUs on top of each other. You can't add a brain on top of another person's brain. That just makes them confused. And also, brains don't work like that. But thirdly is that they have extreme research. They have all the internet access of papers all around the world. So we have the expertise not just of one PhD, but of hundreds of thousands of PhDs working together, the collective sum of human knowledge. Why then is this incredibly good for the world? Number one is that digital crimes that affect millions of vulnerable people through scams and fraud, through, for example, this erosion and destruction of democracy, through fake news and illegal fund transfers to terrorist groups. But also secondly is that the internet becomes a better, more organized place to share information and to understand one another, creating a better, more advanced and more prosperous human race, where news becomes more trustworthy, where research becomes better and massively speeds up, because we can actually trust the data that's being used and the data that's more transparent for people, that allows us to publish things that can actually fix problems. So maybe they get a very dynamic and very democratic internet, and in the end it just dies because we don't have the research to solve climate change or to solve AGI in addition to this. All of this is to say that we have just lost the capacity to surveil the internet, which is the future of our world, the future of our children, and the world by which we will operate in for the near future. What we say is that we should at least aspire to have an AGI that has the capacity to monitor this, rather than human beings that have so clearly failed. For these reasons, propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on the Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Three shoutouts. One, to my family. Second, to my girlfriend. And third, just because he asked for it, to Daniel Ypil. Three things in this speech. One, why AGI is a bad thing, regardless of what you think will happen. Second, why it's bad to have a global policy on these types of things. And thirdly, while states will use this to justify limiting internet access if they cannot control what happens on their internet. First, why is AGI a bad thing? And I want to know, despite all of David's preemption, as per what he says, AGI does not exist, and therefore a lot of the countermeasures that David employs still have to be mechanistically proven within the context of the debate. But before that, I want to deal with the very real possibility that this AI will start acting in its own interest, i.e. the doomsday argument. There are three reasons why. One, I want to note that this presumes a universal access to everything that happens on the internet, both on the dark web and also what happens on the current internet, which means that they have an absolute large amount of knowledge and a large data set with regard to how they want to make decisions. But firstly, I want to note that it can see itself as the root of any potential change and therefore justify ensuring that its own self-preservation is the most important thing. And this is a perfectly valid line of logic, right? If it's true that I am the only actor that can conceivably make a change within AI moderation, then obviously I can justify editing policies to benefit me and only me, because nothing can change absent my thing. But second, it's that there are constantly learning, reinterpreting these things in its own data sets. And no, we don't even know to what extent we can determine what triggers a person to be crazy, a person to be psychotic. If this person has human capabilities and is ever constantly learning, how can we determine the turning point for this AGI in the future regardless of what happens? But lastly, it's that they can learn to be selfish. And I want to know, humans are smart, but this AGI can learn forever. It is a constant body of knowledge, an amalgamation of anything that has ever been submitted to the internet, which means that it can outsmart every single person, every single thing that you could conceive of trying to do if you give it enough time. Which means that even if it doesn't happen in the short term, it at the very least will happen at some time in the future. Why is this powerful? Because content moderation and the internet, how people perceive themselves, are necessarily based on the internet that they talk about, how people see things, how people learn. And therefore, if you give them the power to moderate this content, they use it for their own means. They use it to convince people that they ought to give AI more and more power. So perhaps now it's content moderation. And the next thing it's going to be about welfare, about general policy. And insofar as this is something that is inescapable under their side, even a 1% chance of this happening means human race ending, which means on a utilitarian metric, we already win the debate. But even outside any doomsday scenarios, and this is the second argument, which is already taking them at their best, they simply won't make the right decisions to a clear lean towards the rich and powerful. There are 4 things that I want to note here. 1, AI development as of current is top-heavy, and it will always be top-heavy. You know why? Because AI by itself is a competitive advantage, which is why China and the United States will not share their AI developments with any other country, and therefore, what they'll do is keep it to themselves, which means heading the creation of this AGI will always be about the top 7 countries, about China, the United States, Russia, and all of those things. But second, that these countries do not have lens for the outside world. And often they're self-interested, bound by their own social contract and obligations to their own citizens, but as well as the individual incentives of the politicians in power, which means that they have perverse incentives to ensure that it doesn't develop in a way that is equitable for everyone. But lastly, look at the context of what happens as a prerequisite for letting this AGI take control. It is the United States, China, and all of these large AI powers ceding control of this moderation policy, which is important because importantly, this means that they won't go down without a fight. And therefore, if you want to be able to use their knowledge to be able to create AGIs, the prerequisite is granting them a bigger hand at what that means. Which is also bad because fourthly, it means that it determines the data sets that happen there. That they're still going to purposefully, not in terms of capacity, but purposefully and incentive structures, take the worst data sets for the developing world in order to increase their competitive advantages. Why is this bad? Necessarily because what is good and what is seen in content should be moderated, oftentimes is not the sole determinant and something that should be left to a global body. A picture of Muhammad could be content moderated in other countries like France or China, but we think that these things are perfectly fine in other countries that see it important, because the state by itself is an amalgamation of the preferences of people. So even if the 51% are listened to under their side, there's a 49% that remains unhappy. We say that the state ought to be making these decisions for people. And I want to know all the other things on child pornography and ensure the dark web are outside of this debate, insofar as one, this is likely the sort of content that AI cannot moderate because it's in the dark web. But secondly, you can actually track down these suppliers, and we are already on a path towards ensuring that these things get better dealt with under their side. But lastly, and this is the most important thing that I want to know, what happens when you disallow states from being able to control what people see? And I want to know, the internet and content is the prerequisite and the ways by which people make their own decisions. If they cannot control whether or not you see populist propaganda on the internet, they control your access to the internet. They control whether or not you can access Instagram, whether or not you can talk to your families. Because any singular thing and anything outside state control, especially in the worst of states, like China, like Afghanistan, like any other dictatorial state, necessarily makes that decision for you. Which means one, far more political backsliding that happens under their side. Because states cannot take the chance anymore. What happens if this AGI gets worse? What happens if this AGI develops in the way that it doesn't want to? What if they show the actual policies of the other party? We say that they aren't willing to take this trade-off under their side. Before I go on, sure, David.
Your first point is that AGI will outsmart any humans. Your last point is that the state will outsmart AGI. So which one is it?
The first thing that I want to note is that these engage on 2 separate frames. We are able to engage in nuance because this is a good debate, David. What we'd explain is that in a doomsday scenario, perhaps in the long term, this is always going to be likely to happen. It's inevitable. But in the short term, engaging with your case is when states can utilize it to their own advantage. Limit internet access, which doesn't mean that they have to outsmart the AI, but ensure that people won't even see it in the first place, which happens the most in the third world where individuals are already limited in terms of their capacity and knowledge, which means that they entrench authoritarian regimes under their side. It is their side where Bolsonaro and Duterte are more likely to win elections, where people grow up and never learn to the extent that they have, or are able to engage in other policies beyond what happens within their borders, simply because they force them to make that decision. Very simply put, this AGI will either kill the world at some point in the future, or it's the case that states will use it and justify it in order to entrench power within themselves. We think that this decision ought to be to the states, because if it isn't within the hands of the states, it's when they'll make far worse decisions. For all of these reasons, opening opposition is winning this debate.
Alright, thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on BPM. You're here.
Hello, a few shoutouts to my family, to the ADS, and more importantly to David. Thank you for coming, for deciding to spend like the last 2 days of your weekend before you go back to Cambridge debating and helping me and all the other juniors and current varsity to learn more and to aspire to debate. I hope to at least, if we don't win the final, at least make a speech that you can be proud of. Thank you. The internet is dead. And what side opposition refuses to believe is the reality that we have right now, in which I'll introduce the 3 comparatives that they have to defend. The first is that internet is dominated by private individuals through companies like Facebook and Twitter because of strong lobbying power, because they have massive monopoly and we are all beholden by it. So even if we agree that Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk suck, we will all use Twitter and Facebook and we will scroll TikTok until it's banned at the end of the day anyway. Secondly, digital policies enforced by countries that either first will still have selfish interests because politicians, for example in the Philippines, have massive troll farms, are ones that have political biases and alliances that are beholden to first. And that's why democracy on their side is a farce. Because if you're giving the control of the internet and digital information to the very politicians that have the interest to win power, that is why they will manipulate it to their own extent. But even in the best case of side opposition, we are dealing with humans, governments of different companies that don't understand and will never have the capacity to comprehend the internet and therefore to effectively moderate it. Lastly, on their side, it is where you have to deal with actors like the United States and China because vis-a-vis either the private media monopoly that I've explained earlier or the fact that they are the ones that have national power. Their argument only flies if you believe that we're giving the AGI only national authority, and that's why we need to give them absolute global authority in order for them not to be controlled by the United States, in order for them not to be controlled by China. And I want to point out and weaponize the info slide. They said that this can be used in the first mover's advantage by China and the United States. Note that AGI, not like rigid AI, is one that can develop on its own, that can have human capacity of its own, and to also consume data and go outside its programming. And that's why their argument falls then. Note that AGI is not existent. We have to operate in a world and it's hypothetical, and that's why they can't use this world as a means to rebut us, because it's about a hypothetical world where the info side is true and is law. The first thing that I want to respond to is the doomsday analysis that comes from side opposition. The first thing they assert is that the self-preservation of AGI relies on human extinction. This is just not false for 2 particular reasons. The first is because the AGI relies on human society to live in, like you need the fact factories to work, you need the internet to work, you need telecommunication lines and people to function day by day. And I would even say that the AGI is likely to be pro-environmentalist. Shout out to Rogelio, because if the Earth doesn't exist anymore, then the AGI will not live. And not since the AGI doesn't die, the AGI has long-term interest because it has the capacity to live forever, unlike humans that only have 50 to 75 years of human lifespan. The second is that their own analysis works against them. It is the fact that AGI can outsmart us all. It's the fact that because the AGI is so much of a genius, it can think of a solution that helps everyone. I would flip their own analysis. Humans are also selfish, but the difference between us and them is that we lack knowledge. Our human intellect is only limited to our own experiences and what we can learn throughout the day. And that's why any solution that any human would want to implement in digital policy is one that will harm other people. But an AGI is just smarter than everyone and all of us that will probably figure out a solution that doesn't have to harm anyone to begin with. Lastly, the AGI is likely to be more benevolent than the average human. And that's because they just have the capacity to understand more people. It's a fact that they're able to expose themselves to more media, into more content, more than you and I can interact with the everyday person is what is going to make it sympathetic. Again, we're not dealing with AI, we're dealing with AGI. That's the debate. Nacho can't get away with saying that we have to deal with the real world. This is a hypothetical world, and therefore I beg opposition to have bigger imagination towards this. The next part of this is to explain why the AGI is effective. And I want to then weigh why the democracy and you being able to choose doesn't work. Aside from the fact that it's broken, because if you give it to the politicians to control the internet and information, obviously they'll manipulate that, and therefore democracy is just a moot point anyway. We would say that a lot of the things that we have aren't relied on you believing that democratic values are effective or not. Things such as being able to prevent fake news and scams from being spread around. Things like people losing their private, their private information, their bank accounts, their information being leaked for anyone and everyone to use requires very, very specific and very, very highly technological skills that you need a body that is able to respond to this in particular. The first thing is that digital policies get passed because it's unilateral and it's absolute. AGIs can sync and consider different contents, spot different internet ecosystems that are very different across developing countries, across developed countries, and therefore find the ways in which what is the best firewall for us to prevent any hacking. What are the best ways for us to regulate communication between individuals that individual countries and politicians can do without massive cooperation for us to get there to begin with. But secondly, the comparative on their side is competing interests. So there are some governments that are literally tied to cybercrime and trafficking rings, and some of them just have limitations either because of bias or we just don't have the technological skills to be able to do this. Before that, Nico.
Would you be transparent with how this AGI works and what its algorithms prefer?
No, and we don't need to be transparent because as I've explained to you, AGI would not want to prevent you from talking to your families, would not want to kill off the environment, right? We don't care, and we'd rather trade off transparency because you can't guarantee transparency. Do you know the algorithm of Facebook? You don't know the algorithm of Twitter. And even if it is exposed to the average human, you and I cannot comprehend it and can't adapt to it. Which is the second point. It's only AGIs that are up to par with this task. It's the fact that the internet involves fast. There are millions of data, right? And therefore, even if you believe that we have the most benevolent human data engineers, the most benevolent politicians that on top of all the other issues they have to think about, will think about this. At the point where you do have digital policy, it's outdated, it's ineffective. Which means then that at the end of this, we claim a lot of our impacts then. Lastly, I want to make a large flip of this. We can't really guarantee, right, if you're able to have the internet be a safer place. I think it's a good thing where people live in a world where they don't think the internet is as safe as they think it is. It's the fact that we have a veneer of safety in the internet. We can trust it because it is run and it's free. When it's in fact not, that people freely just give out their information. That people say whatever they want in the internet. It is on our side where people know the fact that there is this huge magnanimous entity, right? Where they're going to be a lot more careful with exposing their political stances with things that they're not comfortable with. On side opposition, they have the veneer of safety. People have the veneer of freedom. And that's why they're a lot exposed. When in fact, they're probably surveilled by governments. They're probably surveilled by Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. And they don't know what they're using that particular way. At the end, maybe it's true that the internet is not free, but it never was, it never will. This is the truth. For all those reasons, side with Gov. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on DLO. Here.
Firstly, thank you to my wonderful girlfriend for being here, supporting me, and also breaking as a wonderful judge in this wonderful tournament. Secondly, I was told to shout out this person. Thank you to Daniel for being a wonderful person. And lastly, thank you to Pao Tainam for being a very important alumni. He told me before the speech, before this round, to name my extension the Pao extension, so therefore it is now the Pao extension. Alright, starting 3, 2, 1. Closing government will take a brave stance today. Firstly, we will clearly explain why AGI needs to be made urgently, because the comparative is likely multiple different corporations or countries creating something that will be far greater harm in the short term. Secondly, we will make a brave stance here. There is much to be gained from artificial intelligence, but it is not democratic at the point where we fear it too much and we do not have trust. We need a global AGI to have trust, especially for vulnerable countries, in order for them to compete, in order for them to thrive in this new world of AI. Firstly then, first extension. Why is it likely that an AI governing body is needed specifically right now, dealing the death blow to opposition on the comparative as well? There are 2 layers to this extension. Firstly, why is it leaving the status quo incredibly terrible and likely to lead to far worse harms? 3 things to say here. Firstly, corporations will or countries will not agree to any particular large-scale policy if they do not think that other countries will also agree to it. Instances, for example, the US has a specific version of its own AI enforcement or moderation enforcement in the same way that China does. It doesn't share the intelligence or networks between them. It doesn't have a larger scale kinds of moderation. The reason why larger scale, multiple regional cooperation is important, because there's multiple different threats that threaten different regions that one region is too late to address because its particular EU GDPR, for example, is not attuned to addressing those particular threats or new things, for example, fake news or moderation. Number 2, corporations increasingly now, and if we leave it to time, will more able to create antitrust or more able to dodge antitrust on their side of the house and create laws that completely make them and enable them to do worse harms, to meddle in elections, especially because they have so much resources to stack courts, to stack people against, for example, moderating them. They're more able to invest in AIs and dangerous AI acceleration that create far more fake news on their side of the house without any particular counterbalance to that. But thirdly, note crucially, David says these things are so incredibly big, but doesn't explain why they need to be multiple different global database. We have a big enough database under our side to actually make it predictive. The problem on their side of the house is they're always reactive. They don't have a big enough database of all the threats that are happening right now at every specific time to stamp on it before it even reaches to other areas, before it gets worse. Under our side of the house, now we have all of the information from different networks across the entire world, such that we have a big enough database to, number 1, scale a big enough response, but number 2, predict before these things even happen in the first place. It's also other corporations making AI that's very, very dangerous. All of these problems happening before they even happen in the first place. Secondly, why isn't AGI under our side needed urgently, even if it's not perfect? Sure, maybe it's sometimes not the best, for example. Maybe there's some way to which you can have more nuanced solutions. Number 1, this is very crucial. Most countries in the world cannot invest in adequate AI protection or, for example, their own particular laws. This is also why so much fake news meddling happens in the Philippines, because you have not enough the ability to invest in these things. We need a global body to act right now, especially with the threats that happen across the world, to prevent these kinds of harms, introducing in our elections, into our democracy. Secondly, this serves as a deterrence effect from future harms, especially with corporations and benevolent governments, from happening into the future. If there's an incentive on both sides to use bad technology in a bad way, it's likely to be done with the biggest actors without any bigger, like dog, or for example, holding them to account. Like for example, as they say, the US would do AI anyways. It's like to weaponize this against the developing world or their enemies. We have something far bigger under our side, which serves as a deterrence effect. They cannot just do this without getting away with it. Now under our side of the house, there's a large enough AGI that can attribute particular attempts at meddling, for example, in different elections, particular failures in moderation, like to Twitter, for example, and solve these problems. But thirdly, this is the most important thing. We cannot have humanity police itself because it's incredibly costly. Not just costly because, well, it's costly the cost that it has to the people that have to moderate. Literally looking at child porn, for example, is incredibly, like, not only just taxing, it's also very costly, for example, to have this scale infinitely, but also because the cost is not using important technology we really need to uplift people's lives. And this is the second extension. Notably,
On either side of the house, AI moderation might not be perfect, maybe there are threats. But what we know for sure is this. The second extension. Why does a global AGI improve the ability to use important tools that we need to uplift our lives, especially for vulnerable communities? On either side of the house, AI will still be subversive, but also incredibly powerful. It can be used in healthcare, it can be used in education, it can be used in important things, like for example, improving people's intelligence, improving people's ability to access information. This is already being used. The problem on their side is that, number one, it's not likely that they trust it, because there's so much corporate control and ability to dodge regulation on their side of the house, which is why communities that could use it to educate their children, could use it to, for example, uplift their lives, don't do so, especially in the developing world, at the point where they don't think their capacity is enough to help them. Secondly, they don't do it because there's incredible ability for their own governments to meddle in their own internet, like the banning of TikTok, for example, at the point where they think other countries are using their own capacities and there's not enough a global network to hold everyone accountable. Why do we hold everyone accountable? Before I go on to the second layer of this extension.
Again, this presupposes the fake comparative that AGI is governed also under our side of the house. But even if that's true, at the very least, if it's on a private or national level, the amount of people that can be fucked over by this AGI is significantly less.
Number one, you assume that the AGI will fuck over people, but clearly it's the case. Number one, it's the ability to learn from it, as what opening government says. But number two, why would a global entire body not just somehow, not be held accountable if it fucks up someone and be corrected in the ability that it fucks up these particular countries? It's incredibly, very, very negative case on your side. There's no comparative. Secondly then, why is it better under our side of the house? Firstly, at minimum, if you don't believe that this thing is super effective, it just serves as a symbol that we can trust these things. If an AI exists in your smaller capacity, when we're able to trust in it as a local citizen, if you think there's a bigger AI, more capable AI, that's able to stamp out the worst possible effects that it could do to your community, do to your country, you're able to trust in education systems that use these things, healthcare that uses these things, at the point where you believe you're more able to have these kinds of things because there's something big enough to intervene, especially for countries that don't have the ability to have their own enforcement. Secondly, we're able to trust that these things can develop as well. At the point where there's something that's also learning, we can also develop greater and greater and stronger and smarter AI. Also, there's not a lot of greater fear in AI accelerationism, which I want to know is able to uplift a lot of people's lives. The problem on their side of the house is that they stamp out any progress in it, or only the progress exists in developed nations and not in developing nations where it's crucially needed. Especially it's like lower staffing for things like healthcare, education, and the like. We uplift people's lives, and it's the most crucial impact in this debate. Because clearly, if you don't believe the deadlock and opening half, you believe trust under our side is greater. Alex builds this in 5 seconds. I build this as an extension, the POW extension. For those reasons then, oppose.
Alright, thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on member of opposition. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me? I don't usually do shoutouts, but shout out to anyone who is underdressed. I will let you credit my arguments even if I'm making them in shorts and a t-shirt that don't have a polo like the other boys. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Isaac Asimov wrote stories of how human innovation would slowly allow us to create our own gods. Little did he know that we would be responsible for the devil. I want to explain how we enter in this debate. I think what opening opposition explains is that because the nature of how this AI is going to be created is likely to be incredibly unequal, is likely to bias large countries with huge AI capacity, then it leads to massive harms. I think what opening government does correctly is to explain that AGI is different from other AI. It slowly starts to build capacities for independent thinking that slowly move it away and further from its creators. So maybe this is initially true from opening opposition, but becomes less and less relevant to address the incredibly potent harms that I think opening government wants to be able to prevent. The second thing I want to explain is that the most important harms of this debate are not objective harms like deepfakes, like child pornography. Because not only is there a global consensus that this is dangerous, but also likely that we have tools to be able to use other forms of AI to be able to prevent these things. What I would argue instead is that the subjective, such as the bounds of what free speech is, what political ideologies are allowable and therefore are the main reasons that we have to debate this debate. What do I think then is the harm of a global body or a global authority that is going to have absolute power? What opening government explains is that we have massive governments that politic, that have their own agendas and want to be able to frame data policy in their own kind of advantage. I think what we do instead, once you have the government policy, is not do this in how we create the AI, but do this in how we manipulate the data and information that the AI feeds on. So here's the existential threat I'm going to introduce. How do we ensure that the way AI develops, thinks, and processes information in a quote-unquote logical manner is more likely to be biased with the same dangers opening opposition possesses, without saying that this only happens in the creation process? How do you trick an AI? 3 things. The first is you manipulate the data that it works with. So for example, if I want to explain, and as OG props, that we are going to iterate over the multiple preferences of people to be able to make subjective decisions, what happens if you flood the internet with these kinds of preferences that your government wants to be able to have? What happens when you start to publish what are social media seeming posts that quote-unquote represent the natural and organic wants and preferences of individuals? And I want to know, this is not fake news. These are not things that you can validate or invalidate because these are the objective, or rather, subjective preferences and opinions of individuals. The second thing to note is you can trick algorithms. So there are many algorithms that want to be able to do things like ban fake news, etc. What you can do is post a bunch of fake news, but slowly sweep in a little bit more and more of a certain political ideology. So that AI that is reasonable, that can logic this out, starts to see there is getting a stronger and stronger association with what is fake and the certain beliefs that this group possesses. These are ways in which the existence of data information starts to become this legitimate belief ends up becoming associated with what is fake and invalidated. The third thing to note is that security and AI is just a software, right? It is how we make decisions, it is not the body. There are incredibly pressing and urgent innovations within computing that make it more and more difficult to be able to create a secure artificial general intelligence that do not give us the assurance that people can manipulate the data, the algorithms, and how this works. Quite notably, we are making this as, in a motion in this household, we would do this today. We are making this before we understand and know how quantum computing is going to work. That is going to overrun all the existing cybersecurity and encryption methods we know today. And therefore, even if we build an incredibly robust method of being able to make decisions and enforce policies, we do not know if the control and the systems and servers in which these policies are created, generated, and enforced are going to be safe as a consequence. Quite notably, if I want to attack an AI, I publish less and less information about quantum computing and what it can do. I publish less and less details about what innovations and kinds of computing I'm going to create, so that AI doesn't know how I'm going to get at it when I do. I'll take the PR emoji.
The problem with the comparative is that OO already concedes to narrow AI, which makes national governments too strong to be regulated, as well as private AI, which can already outsmart its national masters to still threaten the world.
No, again, narrow AI is, number one, still going to be checked by humans, and therefore, if we start to notice these associations in our dangerous. But secondly is, we can just err on the side of caution. If we think free speech in general is preferable, and we do not want an AI to curb what is free speech and legitimate political discourse, we can continue to do that when we feel like it is starting to get dangerous. So, why is this then incredibly bad? 3 things. The first thing is, this discourages collaboration. Because in status quo, if you want any kind of regional regulatory framework like GDPR within the EU, it is incredibly difficult to do this without wanting to be able to get everyone on board. Because if I outlaw this, but it is still legal on servers elsewhere, then I cannot get their consent and I cannot get them on board. I think that's good. Because that encourages us to be able to build a consensus between multiple nations and understand what is the kind of AI policy we want. It is likely to err on what is the greater consensus for all human beings. You do the opposite here. Because the way that we fight is not on a public forum that everyone can see, but the way we fight is through data and manipulation. The way we fight is by tricking algorithms to be able to do what we want and what we say. As a consequence of that, this is a far worse form of being able to handle the dirty politics that government says. The second thing is to be able to say, this is going to be shifted towards the powerful ideologies. OO says these are the ones with the more AI capacity. Again, that is irrelevant. What we note is the ability to produce information, the ability to flood the market, and the greater capacity to have computing power is then the incredibly dangerous kinds of inequality that we create to be able to tilt it towards one side or another. The third thing is, the nature of AGI is that it is even better than humans at thinking and logically processing. And that makes us far less susceptible to the dangers that it has and far more unpredictable the nature of its harms. So there starts to become political ideologies that we become less aware of because our algorithms have blocked them as dangerous when they could have been completely legitimate and represented an important minority and group of people. When we do not understand and know the information that we do not know, this is the kind of AI that then is going to create its own fascist dictatorship. What I want to conclude here is that the comparative is not an AGI that is incredibly perfect because the information that is then created as a consequence of the dirty politics government says is so bad is now muddied and poisoned. But also that the mechanisms to prove this argument are no longer relevant by opening opposition because they fail to make that meaningful distinction between AGI and regular AI. I think the important thing to note in this debate is that because opening government explains that AI is going to be quite strong, opening opposition does not take this. We take this role. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on Government Whip here.
We agree that this debate is not about whether or not AGI is good or bad, but rather whether or not it is just that we create a global authority. The extension coming from Jello bypasses the opening government that successfully proves AGI could do some good in combating a lot of cybercrime, but primarily does not take into account the fact that it is important to gain as much global representation as possible. It is important to ensure that most individuals are involved so that we can encompass as many cybercrimes as possible so that we can bypass a lot of the claims coming from opening opposition and closing opposition as to why this is not likely to work. The first thing I'm going to talk about is opening opposition. Their primary win condition is to prove that AGI is bad, and David fairly preempts that AGI is not susceptible to human forms of corruption, i.e. bribery. But Sam says in response that AGI is flippant, self-serving to their own bias to the interest often of the top 7 countries by which they get data. But these are all significant flaws of human-driven enforcement that exist to greater degrees of exclusivity and opposition. Like number 1, the capacity to lie and deceive. You can say in the vetting process or the interview as a coder for a cybersecurity firm or a content moderator for a business processing outsourcing unit that you're an individual that supports due process, is a centrist individual, but do something different when you are actually in front of the computer computing the code. Number 2, it is intangible abstract biases like religion that make you feel a certain way about Gandhi or a certain way about certain religions that cannot be undone by individuals in the international community. Versus AGI, where it may be strict to its IG codes, and even if it is possible that they will arrive at a more radical stance, it is a logical stance nonetheless, which is a response to pre-existing stimuli and conditions. So they don't have absolute loyalties to their state. They don't have absolute loyalties to religion. They don't have absolute loyalties to political parties in the way that individuals do. And therefore, even if they can act on their own agency, it is often in the interest of responding to what is most utile for their service, which is to content moderate, which is to perform cybersecurity, and therefore, even if it is technically bad and there are some negative externalities, it is still one that is utile for the greater good. Number 3, they say it's biased to countries, but the global authority implies that the access to data you have in the process of building this AGI is likely to come from different countries. That is the framing that comes out at Jello, that even if it is only covering the top 7 countries now, in the global authority, it can cover more far-flung areas, cover the context of regions in the Philippines, cover parts like Latin America and Africa that are more underrepresented in research, and that's how you're likely to benefit because you understand those contexts so that you don't run into the flippant characterizations coming from opposing opposition. But finally, they explain the idea on free speech. But really, think about this, and I'm sure Ignacio knows this as well, because there are many ways that we can bypass rights to express in the interest of the greater good. There are many individuals that are often using these crimes or using the internet to orchestrate financial crime, orchestrate child pornography, for example. And a lot of those individuals that are victims of financial crime and victims of child pornography are experiencing a greater severity of harm. And therefore, if there's an individual that is like, I don't like it that you are censoring my ability to access Instagram. I don't like it that you won't let me post a photo of Gandhi. Well, boo-hoo. There is an individual out there, thousands of children that are being abused. We would prefer that we employ a utility that can allow us to access as many crimes as we want so we can authorize to penalize them in comparison to your nebulous idea of free speech. The next thing I want to talk about is that let's weigh why the extension coming from Jello is more important. Because under their side, they prioritize private companies executing on their own. The reality is that there is a greater harm. And it's not just what opening government agrees, which is that it's the individuals that are affected by cybercrime and that have to be combated by cybersecurity and content moderation. It's also the individuals behind the computer. These are individuals that have more pragmatic and greater moral consideration. Number one, it is principally unjust. The reason why we enforce digital policies like content moderation is because we believe that average people like you and me do not deserve to see the worst horrors of the internet. But for all of these individuals that are forced to direct code that will be at the forefront of the horrors of war, forced to watch live leaks day in, day out, almost like 24 hours, to the point that they feel like they are experiencing the pain of the individual itself. We feel like we are extending and disregarding that freedom from protection towards them. And therefore, the current way that content moderation and digital policies are executed in opposition, for some reason, disregards the interest of the people, and therefore, under a world where AGI exclusively is enforcing it, absent the touch of humans like you and I, the instant benefit there is that you are removing people from a degree of harm that is absolutely unnecessary. But number two, we would suggest that it is independent of opening's issue on curbing cybercrime. Because again, whether or not you agree it is perfect, what you have to agree is that someone at the end of the day is suffering. The presence of a global authority utilizing AI will remove that harm. Closing.
You explained that the world today has a series of actors with dangerous incentives to be able to moderate the internet in a particular way. Why would they not have the incentive to instead manipulate the AI once this exists?
Okay, closing opposition. So I appreciate CEO's attempt at proving that there is a logical conclusion to why they would become bad AGI. But number one, it's hard to get people on board in order to have a greater consensus that this is exactly what they want. It is also possible that we can ascertain and perform data integrity in order to ascertain whether or not this comes from true forms, from institutions and individuals that currently do want to espouse these types of contents to make the AGI believe a certain type of logic so that they can become more bad and radical. But number two, I don't understand why this specific body is free from the rest of the international community who also scrutinizes other states, also scrutinizes other regional alliances independent of that international community. And so if we feel like this AGI is a little sus right now, why all of a sudden are they advocating for a dictatorship in Syria, that it is entirely possible that we can penalize them, review the code, review their current actions, and find accountability out there? That is only possible when you get the rest of the world involved. In a world where it is desexualized, which is likely to happen in opposition or done through private companies, you don't get that type of check and balance because it's not pushed into the sphere of the international community. But number three, it is a greater level of transparency. Things like, for example, the ability to interpret the code only exists on AGI, but humans can easily lie, and there's no way for you to ascertain what is existing in the inner workings of their mind that are an enigma. And therefore, if there is an individual that is coding in a specific way that is bad, that is content moderating in a specific way that is biased and pervasive, you cannot ascertain that. But AGI, at the bare minimum, is something that you can review, and in the worst case, we can always nuke it down. In the worst case, we can always go to war with AGI. These are all forms of things that we do now to exercise radical intervention for bad faith actors. Why can't we do it in CG?
Alright, thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on opposition whip here. extension that opposing opposition runs is one that engages with the frames of all teams in this round. We explained why we hijack the incentives of politicians that comes from OG. We explain and engage with the frame that perhaps this AI is wrong coming from OO. And we hijack even more the incentives and the conflicts that are likely to happen when it comes to CG. What we do specifically is explain why doing things like changing the information, making it less transparent, being able to poison the well through those same incentives that exist on both sides means that it is so hard to be able to challenge it at the end of the day. It is difficult to be able to address these things when we do not know when we are unsure of what is happening. But most importantly, when we look at it in the frame of AGI, that is not a human person thinking, but most importantly, someone who goes beyond that. But the second thing that this extension does is engages with the frame of how AI is likely to develop instead of just asserting how it will be. So all teams in this round will try to say that AI develops in this certain way, and what will develop to be able to be strong, it will develop to be certainly evil. But we agree that both will happen. Perhaps there is one good team making good AI. Perhaps there is one that is evil making AI at the same time. But because they both simultaneously exist, and because the incentives to make sure that you have your political incentives in the bad AI, even if you do have good AI at the same time, because those will continuously coexist, because those incentives will cause you to make those creations, cause you to make that development, it means that you always have them in challenging each other. And I think that creates the worst ability to address the issues. So I'm going to explain the comparative and how we address these things in the status quo. Because this is the greatest gripe of government side of the house. There is no possible alternative of being able to address this. That is why we must turn to AGI. There are a few reasons, maybe monopolies, things like governments being able to manipulate policy that we hear from OG, maybe like just a comprehension skill issue of people not being able to understand what AI does. There are several reasons as to why we can address this already in the status quo. You can have AI consultations, be able to get the same information, be able to also make predictions, right? Through even narrow AI that doesn't require you having like a beyond human mind to think about it. But most importantly, they try to really like hard press the incentives of people to be evil when I think there are incentives to be selfish, but to go against these issues. So maybe it is the fact that you want to win and get power, but it's the fact that you also don't want your opponent to have those same ability to do that in the future. You don't want them to have the ability to do troll farms. You don't want them the ability to have and spread misinformation. That is why you're going to likely go against it. But also several other incentives, like this being a voting issue, that people caring about their data privacy, therefore voting in governments that are going to forward these policies as their forefront issue. Like things like this is going to be a bad image if you continue to allow your administration, even if there are like deepfakes or like spreading that you do not continuously address. But I think, and like the last thing that CG tries to propose in this issue, which they claim is an extension, is that it is just too simply expensive to make your own enforcement of AI. I think this is just not true, right? With the rise of AI means also the rise of access to it, the ability to make this more efficient in the future. So although it gets harder to moderate it also becomes easier to access at the same time. So I don't understand why it does become expensive. But lastly, this just isn't a viable claim because everything is expensive when you address it in that way. I think the real way to break this clash is to talk about reverse the cases. So maybe there is chances that on both sides, there are incentives to want to pursue your political ambitions, pursue whatever selfish interests you have. The difference is transparency, the ability to pursue these issues. There are two reasons why you have more transparency on our side that Nico explains. One, because when you pass policy, you have to come to a debate over it. You have to have consensus. You have to have discussions and find out that this policy is something that people agree with versus the immediate effect that you get on their side, that you do not understand why this policy is being taken place unless you go back and review it in the way future. And this is the second and most important thing that they do not nuance. They can say you can review the code. You only review the code on our side because you can understand it, because it's not beyond human comprehension. That only exists on our side when you do not allow it to completely take over power, when you do not anymore understand how this AI can think, because it is that strong. Only on our side when you're able to understand what it is creating, how it operates, and how you can consult with it. That is the level of transparency that you can offer to people. Why does this take it over OO as well? This takes it over OO because all they say is the non and created, rather than retroactively when thousands of people already have been hurt, thousands of people already have been skewed over by the system. But secondly, you're able to persecute the people who did it. Because maybe on both sides there are politicians who want to create troll farms, people who want to be able to screw over democracy through Facebook. But those people will have it so much worse on their side, when you can hide behind AI, you can hide behind all the cyber threats, you can do things like poison the well, poison the information, and all of those things are one beyond human comprehension and hard to call out. They tried to say that troll farms are hard to find. I want you to investigate and understand if you truly even understand what ChatGPT does. It is so much harder to comprehend these things. At least you can understand why troll farms are made. Those are Facebook accounts that you can make. Those threats look so severely existential on the side of government. And that is why we take it over them and take it over opening opposition. But I want to then explain why else their world is horrible. Before that, I'll take a point from opening.
The problem is transparency is just practically impossible with hundreds of trillions of parameters that we just can't surveil, or hundreds of millions of people around the world that we can't see. The only way you can do this is with an AGI.
So the problem with that is AGI, as you already claimed through Alex, it is untransparent and you don't want it to be transparent. So that's a contradiction. But most importantly, yes, you can much better in comparison be transparent in how you share online information, because you can do things like go through it. I want to talk about then the worst harms that exist on their side. There's an unimaginative class of OG saying it's benevolent because of information that you get online, because it learns it. OO tries to explain that they are pure scum and a selfish AI that is created. The deadlock breaker here is both humans and both AI depend on information. What Miko specifically explains is when AI has the power to legitimize itself by saying it is AI, by saying it has absolute control over you. The reason why that is horrible is because the information itself is unreliable. That you can do things like poison the well, you can do things like manipulate it to benefit you at the end of the day. And because of that, humans are much better at being able to handle this information, even if they have their own political incentives at mind. At the end of this, I want you to look at your notes. I want you to understand that the comparative in this round is being able to create a world where you can hold people accountable. That only exists on CO.
Alright, thank you so much for that speech, and thank you so much for such a great debate. You may now host the house. Thank you.